Good morning, everyone. Muito bom dia para todos. Good morning to those who are here on Zoom, all of our students from the Portuguese 1B class at the California State University, Fresno. And good morning or good afternoon to those of us following us in various different platforms. If you're following us, of course, here in the West Coast of the United States, it's still good morning. If you're following us in the East Coast of the United States, it's barely good afternoon. And of course, if you're following us in Portugal, where our guest is from, it is already kind of almost good evening as far as the time difference is concerned. And thanks to all of those who are following us in different parts of the country and our friends in Hawaii, especially 3 hours ahead of us, and those friends of ours in Hawaii that follow PBBI at Fresno State also really get up early for these events, and we thank them also for doing that. This is essentially, of course, for our students, but we'd like to always share this important information with everyone that is part of PBBI in one way or another. We have, of course, these series that are online, and we have also our in-person series, and we would love to, in the near future, hopefully, have our guest, Tomé Ribeiro Gomes, here at Fresno State. He was born in the island of Terceira, in the archipelago of the Azores, which, by the way, there's 9 islands, as our students know, and that Terceira is the most beautiful. I'm just kidding. Everybody thinks that their own island is the most beautiful. And we kind of call it our island, like it really, like it belongs to us, but it's part of who we are, even after 50 plus years in the diaspora. Studied in Lisbon, having obtained a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and International Relations at Nova University of Lisbon. His MA in Governance, Leadership and Democracy Studies at the Coimbra, or I should say at the Catholic University of Portugal. And he's currently he is working on his PhD, which the project involves the strategic relevance and the geopolitics of the Azores in a post-Cold War world for the PhD program in History and Security Studies and Defense at ESCTE IUL. And so we welcome him to Fresno State once again. We welcome him for another talk, and this one he's going to almost the same theme, but a little bit different. He's going to analyze the foreign policy of the dictatorship. We are, as our students know, and those of you also out there, guests know as well, this is the 50th anniversary of the Carnation Revolution. So coming up very quickly, we're very proud that between the 11th and 15th, we're going to have Commander Jorge Betancourt, who is a retired commander from the Portuguese Navy, who was involved in this process 50 years ago. And so that'll be a piece of history that our students will be able to have live. But before there was democracy, before this revolution that changed Portugal immensely, and I can tell you that because I was a product of the last one, of the dictatorship, where I lived for the first 10 years of my life, and remember things well. And so the before that, there was a dictatorship, and Portugal had a brutal dictatorship. Some people think it wasn't, but it had its brutalities. And to understand democracy, I think in Portugal especially, we need to understand what happened the 50 years or so prior to the democratization of Portugal, prior to the Carnation Revolution and democracy. So, Dr. Tomé Ribeiro Gomes, welcome.
Thank you so much, Denise. Pleasure to be with you and with your students, like last time, which was a year ago.
That's right.
That's right. Now, a year ago. And so I'll invite you as well to watch that video that's in the PBI YouTube, because some of the stuff I'm going to be mentioning, I've mentioned there then, as Denise said, but now we're looking at it from a different angle. So first off, thank you for the invitation, and thank you also for these Golden Jubilee sessions of the Carnation Revolution. And in Portugal, there's obviously a lot of activities that we're having about this. And there's two kinds of activities. So we're concerned with two anniversaries. So there's the 50 years of the revolution, and then we're going to be celebrating until it's the 50 years from the Constitution of 76, because that's when we can say that we have a democracy process ongoing. And I say process because I think democracy is an ongoing process. It's never finished. And so this talk is about the first anniversary, so the 50 years of the revolution. And to understand the revolution, as Dinesh said very well, we need to understand what came first. So we need to understand the dictatorship, Salazar's dictatorship, which is known as the Estado Novo, so the new state. That's how Salazar presented it, the new state. So I'm going to be mentioning the Estado Novo. You know what that is now. And this is the regime that lasted from 1933, when Salazar came to power. He used to be the Minister for Finance. He managed to get all of power, not as prime minister, but as the president of the Council of Ministers. And it lasted until 74. But Salazar was incapacitated in 68. Okay, so that's the end of Salazar. And then his successor comes in, Marcelo Caetano. And there's a lot of hope that he's going to do something different, but turns out he won't, mainly because he won't budge on the colonies. So Portugal still had an empire and was the last big European empire, by then mainly in Africa. And so a bit because of that, Caetano didn't manage to liberalize Portugal and ended up being toppled by the Carnation Revolution, which is called the Carnation Revolution because soldiers put carnations, the flower, in their weapons, in their guns, instead of firing their guns. So it was an almost bloodless revolution. It was an accident. I think one person died, but it was an almost bloodless revolution. And this was a very particular, a very different way to end a very oppressive, repressive dictatorship. I don't think it was a fascist dictatorship. This is a debate which is ongoing in history, because history is made up of these kinds of debates, but it definitely had a lot of proto-fascist elements. For example, there was the Portuguese youth, where you had to pledge your allegiance to the Estado Novo. There was the very strong support on the church, the Catholic Church. There was the support of the military. So you had a lot of planks on which the dictatorship would stand, but it didn't do something which was fundamental for a fascist regime, which was to mobilize the population into a constant motion towards the dream of a new human being, a revolution of the mind. Salazar didn't do this much. He preferred conservatism and to keep people quiet and the tradition and all that. And why is this important? Because Salazar saw as a menace something which started to appear in the Second World War and after the Second World War. He saw it coming. A lot of people saw it coming, and he was very afraid of it, which was US influence on the world. So America leaving its shores, because America was traditionally, since George Washington's farewell address, a very isolationist, or at least staunchly independent country, which would not play ball in European politics, would not get itself entangled, which was the term they used, entanglement, into permanent alliances. So the US was, for the most part, with a few exceptions, for example, the Spanish-American War in 1898, but with these few exceptions, the US was absent from world politics. And in the Second World War, as you know, it's not tenable anymore. So Franklin Roosevelt has to put his hands on the scales of the balance of power, and the US enters world politics. And for Salazar, this was a big menace because he thought American influence would be a corrosive influence on his traditional, conservative, Catholic, reactionary dictatorship. And so you need to understand this, because when we're speaking about politics, for my generation, I'm 30, and for the generations that come after, so for most of your students, Dinesh, it's, I think, difficult to understand the impact of culture, because we're so used to a globalized culture, or to a culture that crosses borders very easily. So globalization, you have the idea of the end of history after the Cold War ends with Francis Fukuyama's 1989 essay. You have the idea that the world is flat by Thomas Friedman, the columnist, and this is a text of his in 2005. So the idea that geography no longer matters, that there's very few obstacles to the spread of ideas, commerce, etc. And we grew up in this, and we grew up in the world of the internet and of American movies from the Portuguese point of view. And so it's hard for us to understand the importance of culture, of channels where culture travels, is communicated from one country to another. But for Salazar, in his world, this was a very different thing. So you could conceivably close your country off from cultural influences, which was what he was trying to do. Today you have examples. You have North Korea, for example. But of course, it's a very extreme example, but where you can see that a country can try, in this case, a brutal dictator again, can try to fence off his country from other cultures. So you cannot look at politics, either domestic politics or foreign policy, without looking at culture. And crucially, culture provides you this nexus, this hinge between domestic and foreign politics. And so when we're looking at the Estado Novo, when we're looking at the end of Estado Novo, we have to ask, what were the influences upon the Estado Novo that made it go in one direction or another, and in the end made it end the way that it ended, which again was a very different way of ending, very bloodless, a very gradual but also quick transition to a different Portugal with openness, but without falling into extremes. So for example, communist extremes, which was a very, very live possibility at the time of the Cold War, when the Portuguese Estado Novo fell in 1974. And so we need to look back, and we need to take the excuse of these commemorations to plunge into some of the details of the Estado Novo in order to understand it better, hoping to understand also the way it ended. And when we do this, we find that the Azores have a very important role to play in how Salazar managed or did not manage to rule in the way that he wanted. And in the standard accounts that you can see, if you read books on Salazar or on the Estado Novo, usually the Azores don't have much of a role unless you're talking about foreign policy, which is what we're going to do here today. But the point is that because of the way the Azores shaped Salazar's foreign policy, the Azores also had a big role in the regime itself, and in how the regime developed, and ultimately how the regime fell. So we're going to start with this operative concept to understand how Salazar viewed the Azores and how the Azores influenced Salazar's politics, which is the concept of strategy. And a very quick definition here from an American military man, Arthur Leake, in 1989 as well. Strategy equals ends plus ways plus means, which means that for you to have a strategy means that you have defined your ends, your objectives, your strategic objectives, and then you have found the ways in which you will achieve these objectives. And these ways will have to come from your means. So what is at your disposal? What are your diplomatic, your military, your cultural means, your assets that you can use to transform into your objectives, to achieve your strategic objectives. And Salazar, after he comes to power in 33, it still takes a while to take control of the foreign policy apparatus, so the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and all that. But his objectives, his strategic objectives, will be the same throughout, so until he's incapacitated in 68. And they are one which goes without saying, which is the same for every leader, even in a democracy, which is preserve the country's independence, the country's sovereignty, the country's integrity. Oh, there's a child screaming his lungs out outside. I don't know if you can hear that. So this one almost goes without saying, but the other two are more specific to Salazar. And they are, one, preserve his regime, so the ideology of conservatism and Catholicism and reactionary way of looking at the world. So you have preserve the regime, and second, preserve the empire, because Portugal was a very small state relative to the size of its empire. So we had lost Brazil in the 19th century, but Salazar still had huge tracts of land in Africa, Mozambique, Angola, also smaller colonies such as Guinea, which would later be Guinea-Bissau, and the Cape Verde Islands. And then we also had territories in Asia, smaller enclaves and islands, but that's not as important to us here. The African Empire will be very important at the moment we're going to be looking at. So when Salazar comes to power in 33, the ways in which he wants to achieve these goals include, for example, casting Portugal as a responsible state. So he takes Portugal into the League of Nations. Okay, Salazar is usually seen as isolationist. So he's got an expression much later, which is, "We are proudly alone." But this must be qualified. So it's not as simple throughout his tenure, but in the beginning, you can see how he takes Portugal into the League of Nations. Portugal participates actively in the League of Nations in mediation cases, for example, when Italy invades Ethiopia. So it's supposed to be an engaged state, responsible state, because Salazar sees international law as a way of keeping his empire. So throughout his tenure, he adopts a very legalistic view in order to protect Portuguese sovereignty from invasion or from independence struggles. So right from the beginning, he takes a very legalistic view of world affairs. But then he's got a major challenge that's presented to him very soon. In 36, you have the Spanish Civil War starting. And Portugal has always had a very delicate position geopolitically, because Portugal is sandwiched between a larger neighbor in the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain, and the ocean, so the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a strip of land in the Iberian Peninsula. And time and again, throughout history, the Spanish have thought, some Spanish leaders have thought, wouldn't it be easy to just sweep Portugal from the map and to unify the Iberian Peninsula? And it's happened in the 16th century, but pan-Iberian projects will resurface now and again. And during the Spanish Civil War, it's very serious for Salazar, because on the one hand, you have the Frente Popular, the Popular Front coming to power, so left wing, which is an ideological challenge to him. If they win the war, then he can expect ideological subversion, again, the importance of culture coming from Spain. And if the right-wing guys win, so this is Francisco Franco, who's going to be the dictator, so he's going to win. But if they win, they also have elements in their coalition, right-wing coalition, who are Iberianists, so they want to take over Portugal. Salazar still prefers them, the right-wing guy, so he supports Francisco Franco, and he wins. So from then on, it becomes part of Salazar's strategy. So one of the ways in which he wants to achieve his objectives, which is to make common cause with Franco. So he looks at his big Iberian neighbor and he thinks, here's someone we can talk to who's very similar to us ideologically, so we can make common cause and hold off the Iberian Peninsula as a bastion of conservative values. And then he's got the other plank, the other major platform on his foreign policy, which is also a secular thing for Portugal, which is the British alliance. So Portugal had a treaty, an alliance with England in 1373, so 14th century, which still today is the oldest alliance still being observed. So he's got international law, he's got his British partners, and he's got the right-wing Franco government in Spain. And the civil war ends in 39. But then in 39 as well, you'll maybe recognize the date, you have the Second World War. So another major challenge for Salazar, maybe even greater, because World War II, as maybe any other world war or global conflict, poses very serious challenges for small states. Because how do you escape intact? And Portugal had an added problem, because besides being a small state, it was a small state which wanted to protect a large empire, which it was not very well equipped to preserve or to defend militarily. So now, more than ever, he's got to play on he's got to use his means and transform them into ways in which to preserve the regime and the empire. And the strategic ways he uses is neutrality. So he's going to try during the entire war successfully to maintain Portugal out of the war. So legally speaking, he invokes the status of neutral. He's a neutral in the war. But then in practice, this means he'll have to play one side, play the other side. He'll have to give something to one side. He'll have to give something to the other side. Because in these kinds of conflicts, you're not neutral if you want to be neutral. You're neutral if they allow you, if they let you be neutral, because you have something the others want. And you have to use these things that you have that they want in order to give it to them, but not in an ostensive enough way that the other side is going to pressurize you into stop doing it. So what Salazar does is he gives, to simplify, he gives to the Germans something which is very important for their war effort, to the armaments industry, which is, at the time, it's called wolfram. There's big wolfram mines in Portugal. Today, it's called tungsten. And it's not as important for the military industry, but it was at the time to make armored vehicles and shells. And so he exports wolfram to Germany. It's the major exporter of wolfram to Germany, actually. Spain also does this, but less of it. And to the other side, to the Allied side, he tells them, well, I can play my friendship card with Franco in order to convince Franco not to go over to the Axis side. And I can give you use of Azorean facilities. And the Azores are very important to the British because they're the plan B if they lose Gibraltar. So the British have got this base in southern Spain, which controls the entry into the Mediterranean. And from the start of the war, it's very clear to the British that they have to preserve this in order to be able to get in and out of the Mediterranean. If the Axis gets Gibraltar, they'll be able to shut the British out of the Mediterranean Sea. And the Azores are the British fallback position. So if they're to lose access to Gibraltar, they'll fall back on the Azores and then mount an invasion to get Gibraltar back. But the Azores, because they're so important, become a very delicate issue and very quickly start to make trouble for Salazar's neutrality policy. So Because Great Britain could not allow Portugal to lose the Azores, and because Portugal has got a very weak navy, you get, especially after the fall of Norway in April 1940, so we're still in the first year of the war, first year speaking in terms of months, so this is the second year, if you want, World War II, year 2. You have the fall of Norway, and this is a surprise to the British. It's a very quick, very surprising thing that the Germans accomplish, and it gives them access to ports from which they can, for example, have their submarines, their U-boats, making trouble on the North Sea. And so the British are starting to feel their naval supremacy become a questionable thing, and this makes them very attentive to the Azores. After the fall of Norway, Winston Churchill becomes prime minister after very tense debates in the House of Commons in London, and he considers in his war cabinet, he considers and he actually favors taking the Azores by force, so occupying the Azores. But his Foreign Office, at the time, this is Lord Halifax, is against this. So he says, let's do this diplomatically. Let's try to convince Salazar to give us access to the Azores, or at least to strengthen the defenses of the Azores. The tension rises a few months later when in June, France falls. So another big blow to the Allies, the fall of France. The panzers roll into Paris. And this also gives the Germans access to very useful ports, this time Atlantic ports in the Bay of Biscay in France. And they're going to build here their main stations, their main bases for submarines, for U-boats. So then in the summer of 1940, Hitler is quite invested in the Atlantic theater. And he starts to be convinced that the war can be won by cutting off Britain from its overseas supplies. So the British Empire depended on exports, and the British war effort even more so on supplies, not just military supplies, but also foodstuffs coming from abroad. And Hitler realizes that mainly using the U-boats, the submarines, he can take out British shipping to the extent that British shipbuilding cannot keep up, and so they won't be able to maintain their what they call their lifeline, their Atlantic lifeline. So he wants to choke Britain. And for this, he personally chooses bases where he can better do this. And he selects Iceland, the Canaries, the Cape Verdes, and the Azores as objectives to occupy. Meanwhile, Winston Churchill tries to persuade Salazar to evacuate the government, the Lisbon government, to the Azores in the eventuality of a land invasion of Portugal, which is the other thing that is a very well-founded concern, because Hitler approves a plan to take place in January 41, so a few months, 6 months from then, approves this plan to invade Portugal. And Franco in Spain is very eager to do this. So Spain also draws up plans to invade Portugal. And now finally enter the US. So Franklin Roosevelt, he saw the war develop, and his main concern was to assuage the American people that the US wouldn't get into the war, wouldn't send soldiers, boots on the ground. They wouldn't die in Europe as they had in the First World War. And this again has to do with the traditional American isolationism. After the First World War, America very quickly retreated again back into its continent and rejected permanent alliances. You have the famous non-ratification of the League of Nations, which was proposed by Woodrow Wilson, but then President Wilson, but then the US themselves rejected, the Senate rejected US participation in the League. So Roosevelt has to deal with this isolationist instinct on the part of the American people and Congress. But at the same time, he starts to see that there's no way the US are going to be able to sit this one out, because if the Axis wins in Europe, which appears very likely at this moment, then they'll be coming over to the US sooner or later, probably making common cause with Japan on the other side, on the Pacific, also very expansionist, also very aggressive. And so the US will be in very hot water unless it helps Europe to defend itself, or Britain, in this case, to defend itself against the Axis. And so you have these speeches by Roosevelt, the fireside chats, where Roosevelt used the radio to communicate directly with the American people. And you have this very interesting fireside chat in December 1940, which I won't read again the quote which I read last year when I talked to you, in which he mentions the Azores. And he says that the Azores are closer to US shores on the Atlantic than Hawaii is on the Pacific. And he asks the American people to imagine the damage that the Germans could do if they occupied the Azores, because they could use it as a springboard from which to attack the US and its allies. But fortunately for Roosevelt, for Churchill, for Salazar, Franco decides to wait, so Spain does not invade Portugal. However, in February 1941, Franco visits Mussolini in Italy, and they discuss what is called the Latin Bloc, or a fascist-leaning alliance to preserve and to save Latin civilization. So this is very imperial language, this idea of civilization, and of a particular civilization. Again, this is difficult for us today to understand because we're not as sensitive to these cultural ideas and how strong they can be in foreign policy. So what you have here is an idea of a Southern European way of ruling and of living, which the empires, and Italy already acquired an empire, and Spain had an empire as well. And so this idea that they had to make a Latin bloc. And this was seen, obviously, as a threat to Portugal. So Salazar would be unable to resist this. And this results in a heightening of tensions about Portugal and about the Azores in particular. You have, again, the Allies pressurizing diplomatically Salazar to strengthen Azorean defenses. Salazar always says that the defenses are good, that the Portuguese armed forces are perfectly capable of defending the Azores. Everyone knows this isn't true, that if Hitler were to make a lightning strike on the Azores, the Allies would fall very easily. Maybe this ironically assuages or makes Britain a bit more comfortable, because they think they are so poorly defended that if Hitler manages to take them, we can then take them back quickly. So this is how bad the situation is in terms of, in military terms, for the Azores. But Salazar, again, is very concerned with the idea of independence and with the losing face. So he rejects British proposals to send technicians to the islands, to strengthen the islands with British forces, rejects all of this. And again, asserts that he wants a neutral Portugal, and any talk of these kinds of things may provoke the other side to attack. So he's very concerned when the American press starts to report after Roosevelt's speech, and whenever there's developments, the American press reports on how the Azores are vulnerable, how the US could easily occupy the Azores or diplomatically or militarily to hold them off against Germany. Whenever this happens, Salazar is very alarmed, very worried. He protests in Washington, so he sends his ambassador to Washington, to the U.S. Secretary of State to make his protestations. But then in March 41, the scenario changes very much, because what you have in March is Roosevelt deciding that the US cannot let Britain fall, and they're going to have to support Britain. So this is the famous land lease, the land lease agreement, whereby the US will furnish arms and supplies to Britain, and Britain doesn't have to pay it back unless until the war is over. So it's basically the US arming Britain, as you have today with the Ukraine. It's a similar situation in that you're not going to fight the war, but you're going to support one side very strongly in order for them to not to lose. But what this does is it makes Atlantic sea lines of communication. So this is the military term, sea lines of communications, but seaways, Atlantic seaways become more important than ever. So you have to be able to take the supplies from the US to Britain without them being torpedoed, without them being destroyed by German stealthy submarines. So now the Atlantic becomes a major theater in what is called the Battle of the Atlantic, which is, despite being called battle, it lasts for the entirety of World War II. And from now on, it's existential to the British, the Battle of the Atlantic. So if they lose, they're probably done for, because their lifeline is cut. So the Allies have to strengthen their naval mobility in the Atlantic. One way to do this is through bases. So the US start to operate from Greenland, from a few bases in Greenland, and the US press again raises the possibility of operating from the Azores. And again, Salazar is very much displeased by this and makes a lot of noises about this. In Washington, the British add further pressure about sending technicians, about strengthening the island's defenses. But then there's an incident where they suggest that the US send a battleship, the USS Milwaukee, to a visit to Lisbon and to the Azores in order to show their commitments to a defense of Portugal. But Salazar, surprisingly for Churchill and for Roosevelt, rejects this. So again, he's concerned with neutrality. He's concerned with not having it appear to the Germans that Portugal is siding with the US, and about standing firm against the US bear hug, the American bear hug that he so fears. Salazar, Roosevelt reads this as an act of hostility. So why is Salazar being so hostile to us when all we want is to defend Portugal against a possible Spanish or German, Spanish/German attack? So he starts to believe that the US have to, because this had been a British suggestion, the visit of the USS Milwaukee, Roosevelt starts to believe that the US have to take the Azorean question into their own hands. So they have to stop depending on the British to be the go-between between Salazar and Roosevelt, or between the US and Portugal, because the British were the secular ally of Portugal. So they have to ditch the British as a go-between and take matters into their own hands. So Roosevelt shifts part of the Pacific Fleet to the Atlantic, and he asks his military chiefs to draw up plans to occupy the Azores. This is known as the War Plan Grey, and it's a lightning strike occupation of the Azores. 28,000 troops to take over the Azores. And then he, in another fireside chat, he starts to prepare American public opinion for this. And again, he tells them, we cannot let the Azores fall into German hands. He also sends a personal letter to Salazar in which he fondly remembers his visit to the Azores, because when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1918, he went to Fayal and to San Miguel, where you had an American base during World War I, in Ponta Delgada. A very informal affair. There wasn't an agreement, an official agreement here. It was a very gentleman's agreement kind of thing, but it was an important coaling station and naval base for the US during their period in World War I, so from 1917 to 1918. But then, just as he's doing this, as he's sending this warm personal letter to Salazar, he's approving War Plan Grey. So on June the 4th, 1941, the US president approves of a plan to occupy the Azores. Why doesn't this happen? This would have changed everything, of course. Why doesn't it? Because 2 days later, Roosevelt changes his mind because he just learned that Hitler was planning on invading the USSR. So he was planning on invading the Soviet Union, invading Russia, despite his non-aggression pact with Stalin. And of course, this would put a lot of strain on German forces. It would open a second front, an eastern front, for the German war effort. And so Roosevelt figured they won't have the power to, they won't have the means to take over the Azores while they're occupied doing that. So he took the opportunity to take over Iceland and to establish a base in Iceland and to wait out on the Azores. Churchill takes the opportunity also to try to get Salazar to draw up his evacuation plans to the Azores, so evacuate the government to the Azores. Salazar, because he's very concerned with independence, rejects doing this, or at least to plan for an evacuation before Portugal is invaded. So he tells Churchill, we'll only draw up plans for this on the eventuality that Portugal is actually invaded. And the British, in July, start talking about having facilities in the Azores, so having infrastructure in the Azores. Salazar, again, suspects an American plan here, and he considers invoking the British alliance in case the US occupy the Azores. So it's seen from today, it's kind of a ridiculous situation, given what we know about Allied planning during World War II, that Salazar would even consider that there could be a split between the British and the Americans to the extent that the British would defend Portugal from the US. So it's very wishful thinking on the part of Salazar, and it shows us that he's thinking in a different world. So he thinks he lives in a different world from what is actually happening in the Second World War. So he's still working on the assumption that Portugal can use the protection of the British against any other kind of influence, which is very much not the case. And you have a very smart Portuguese diplomat who's the ambassador in London at the time, Armindo Monteiro. And there's a telegram that he sends to Salazar where he lays out the case very presciently, so very prophetically. He makes an analysis, which today we read it and we say, yes, that's what happened, where he says, whatever happens, even if the Allies win the war, there's no way Britain is going to come out of this on top. So Britain is not going to be the dominant power in the Atlantic after this is over. It'll be the US, it'll be America. So get ready. So this is, again, he's writing to Salazar. Get ready for a new world. Start thinking of how Portugal can relate to the US. And he actually says that the major principle guiding Portuguese foreign policy since the beginning has been to be on the side of whoever controls Atlantic sea lanes. So he tells Salazar in no uncertain terms, you have to make nice with the Americans. But again, Salazar, if he's known for anything, he's known for his stubbornness. And this doesn't really penetrate his hard head. And he still resists American influence. Then you have a lot of conferences between the Allies. So the US getting very much drawn into the war more and more. You have the Atlantic Conference in Newfoundland, where Roosevelt brings up the Azores with Churchill. He wants a base in the Azores to increase air supports to Atlantic shipping. Then in December, Pearl Harbor. So the US finally gets into the war for good, abandons its neutral status, and it's now a belligerent. So now you have the Allies, or the United Nations, as they call themselves, which will give the name to the organization later. In January 42, you have the Arcadia Conference in Washington, where the Azores are again discussed. So nobody knows what to do with the Azores. The US says, we have to do something quickly. The British, mainly because of the pressure of the Foreign Office on Churchill, say that Salazar can be reasoned with. We can solve the Azores problem without resorting to force. But if Portugal is invaded, yes, we'll occupy the Azores. In the meantime, 42 is a terrible year for the Allies in the Battle of the Atlantic. So it's the worst year in terms of tonnage lost, of shipping that is lost to German U-boats, mainly because the Allies are trusting in new technological developments like the radar in order to pursue a U-boat hunting strategy. So they're very fixated on this offensive, the idea that they're being offensive and not defensive by taking out U-boats. But this doesn't really work because they cannot find the U-boats to the extent that they need to. And in 42 and also 43, you have U-boats using the Azores as a rallying point, so to meet in order then to attack shipping on the Atlantic. And you have them using the Azores as a place where they can replenish, they can refuel their U-boats using refueling ships known as the milk cows. So during all this time, Salazar, sorry, my cat, Salazar is still fixated on the neutrality dogma. But the British finds, and this is a very long story, this is called Operation Alacrity. The British find a formula which manages to satisfy Portuguese neutrality. What they say is, we'll use facilities in the Azores, so in Lajes, in Terceira Island, where I'm from and where Denise is from. We'll use these facilities on the basis of our 14th century treaty, so the 1373 treaty, where we have to support each other. We'll say that it's under that treaty, and so it does not infringe upon your neutrality in the war. You can tell that to the other belligerents, and that's what Portugal does. Salazar accepts this, and this works. He manages to maintain his neutrality. But the US is very unhappy when this happens, because Churchill had promised Roosevelt that the US would be included in the deal. So the US would be able to use the facilities in the Azores that the British would get from Salazar. But they weren't contemplated in the deal. The British didn't even dare to bring this up with Salazar because they knew Salazar would be extremely hostile to the idea. At this time, Roosevelt has got his Joint Chiefs of Staff drawing up a huge list, a very extensive list of infrastructure that they want to use in the Azores quickly. They need access to the Azores very quickly. As Hitler is getting drawn into Russia unsuccessfully, so it's a disaster. It's probably Hitler's worst strategic decision that he makes during the entire war is to invade the USSR. As that is happening, the US are starting to think about going taking the next step, so invading Europe, and they need the Azores for the logistics of this, also for the invasion of Northern Africa, of North Africa. And so they empower their chargé d'affaires, so their not ambassador, but their envoy to Portugal, who is George Kennan, so a major figure. At the time, he's a junior diplomat, but in time, he'll become a major figure of US strategy and Cold War thinking, George F. Kennan. But at the time, he's got the formula that allows Salazar to strike a deal with the US. Very complicated negotiations, but in the end, Kennan devises this formula where they go back to the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty of 1373, where there is a clause that each will help the other's friends. So Portugal can help the British ally, the US, and not, again, not infringe on the neutral status. So again, very difficult negotiations, but they managed to find this formula. I'll try to make this brief now on the Second World War, and the US gained access to the British base in Lage, so they can use it for their logistics. We're talking mainly about air mobility. And then in 44, the other big thing, which is a complete inflection point for Salazar, which is negotiations leading to a separate deal with the US, so not included in the British deal, a separate deal with the US that allows the US to build an airstrip in the island of Santa Maria. And this deal is concluded on the basis that it's not between Portugal and the US, it's between Portugal and Pan American Airways. It's now extinct, but it was the big American Airways air company. And so it would be with a civilian company, not with the US government. The US do this, and very quickly they exhaust the capacity of both Lages and Santa Maria. So the amount of air traffic, of stuff that you need to carry over, military equipment, planes, troops that you need to send to Europe, both for the invasion of Europe, so D-Day, and then after the war, to maintain the US-Europe and US-North Africa bridge, you need the Azores, and you need an expansion of Lages field, which again, in very difficult negotiations, the US managed to obtain from Portugal. So by the end of the war, you have Portugal in this very peculiar situation, an outstanding situation, really, very beneficial potentially to Portugal, where Portugal was able to sit out the war. So it was a neutral country. It did not go into the war, it did not lose its men, did not lose territory. Well, it lost Timor in Asia, but managed to get Timor back because it bundled Timor on the agreement. So the Americans promised that they would give Timor back to Portugal after they took it from the Japanese that had invaded it. They would give Timor back to Portugal if Portugal allowed them to have this separate base in Santa Maria. So they got the territory that they lost back. They did not pay the price of winning the war, but they were on the side of the victors, and their contribution had been the Azores. So this very important contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic, to the end of the Battle of the Atlantic, and to US logistics, military logistics, and maritime surveillance in the end of the war and after the war. So spectacular situation, which Portuguese government could have used in the post-war settlements to become one of the beneficiaries of being on the victor's side. So when you have the institutions that come out of the war, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, then in the Cold War, you'll have the Marshall Plan. A normal government in Portugal would have used this leverage with the US. But we're talking about Salazar, and we've already talked about how resistant Salazar was, how reluctant he was to let in any kind of American influence. And so he did not take advantage of this to the extent that he would have. So he was still concerned with preserving the empire and with preserving his regime, but he thought that changing allegiance from Britain to the US, changing the main thrust of Portuguese foreign policy, acknowledging the US as the new dominant power in the Atlantic, would actually imperil the regime, and given the hostility of the Americans towards European empires, might even endanger the empire. So he resists this. He actually tries to get into the UN because of US pressure, but there's a Soviet veto, so Portugal is kept out of the UN until 1955. So in the immediate post-war, Salazar is still very cautious. There's an attempt by the US to have a 99-year lease on the Azores, which Salazar completely rejects. Still, negotiations continue about the status of the Azores. And in 46, we have the Cold War already starting. In 46, because the Cold War helps Salazar to justify his repression, because he's repressing communists, it presents himself as a bulwark against communists. This gives him enough of a comfortable position to keep negotiating with the US, but he drives such a hard bargain that he obtains something which would be perhaps unimaginable from the US, which is the US guarantees publicly that the US will guarantee Portugal's security. And if you see the diplomats at the time, they say this is something completely novel. So the US, again, since Washington's farewell address in 1796, the US would not make permanent commitments with European countries. So this is the first time the US make a peacetime permanent commitment to towards the security of another country. So you can see how important the Azores are for the US, and you can see how much Portugal could gain from this. But you had this reluctance. So Salazar always thought, even as he got these kinds of political benefits out of the negotiations, and in 46, he for the first time allows the US to have a peacetime presence in the Azores. They transfer from Santa Maria to Lages, and this is when the air base number 4 is created. It's Portuguese sovereignty, but it's used from 46. It's a Portuguese, the command is Portuguese, but it's used by the US Air Force, and at the time the Navy also had facilities in the Azores. But then with, for example, the Marshall Plan, Salazar initially says no, because he thinks this will compromise Portuguese independence. After a few years, he understands that Portuguese finances needs, so he needs the American aid. So he says yes, but it's very relatively speaking, it's not a big amount of money that comes from Marshall aid. And then the moment, which is NATO. In 48, you have the Berlin blockade by the Soviets. So this is the Cold War starting to set in, and the US decide on having an airlift. So again, a lifeline to keep their side of the Allied side of Berlin going, despite it being blockaded, because it was on the Soviet side of Germany, Berlin. So it was, the roads were all blockaded, but the US airlifts supplies in, and Lages plays a crucial logistical role in the movement of cargo to Germany. And so when you have the discussions to set up NATO, which come on the heels of the Berlin crisis, wanting to have a collective security arrangement between the Western countries versus the Soviet sphere of influence, you have an invitation to Portugal. So Portugal is completely out of the discussions about what NATO is going to be. But very surprisingly, Portugal is included, is invited to be one of the co-founders, one of the initial members of NATO, despite it being a dictatorship, when NATO, one of its tenets was, it was a club of democracies. And the only way for you to understand how Portugal was able to be included in NATO is the Azores. Every author who discusses this, it's the only way to explain this. And this is the operative moment here, because with NATO, Salazar, so he had already allowed the Americans to have a permanent presence in the Azores. This brought its own problems. For example, you had political prisoners in Terceira, but after the US had its forces in Terceira, it was very embarrassing to have US personnel witnessing political repression, so you had to move them, the political prisoners, to another place. So it brought its own problems. But because it was in the Azores, it was in an island, Salazar was able to kind of contain the influence, the US influence. And as Denise knows, the cultural influence of the Americans in Terceira was very, very, very much felt by ordinary people, even in terms of English speaking. Terceira people speak English quite well, or my grandmother, who had never taken an English class, would be able to converse in basic English. And this wasn't so in the rest of Portugal. I grew up, and again, I'm 30, so that you can see how long the influence lasts. I grew up eating peanut butter, and quite a big fan of PB&J. When I came to Portugal to study, to Lisbon, you can see here the localism speaking. When I came to Lisbon to study, there was no peanut butter for sale at the supermarket, and my colleagues had never tasted peanut butter. So when we speak about culture and influence, you can see how long this lasts. So I was born in 93, so 30 years after the revolution. So you can see how these things take time. But he was able to contain the influence of the US to the Azores and even to Terceira. But with NATO, it changed. So NATO opened a channel of communication between the US and the Portuguese military. And from 49 onwards, you will have high-ranking military officials from Portugal going to the US to have workshops in NATO, seeing how a military organization in a democracy works, and how feedback, not just from the top down, but bottom-up feedback can improve the way the organization does things. You have them having contact with US culture and society, then coming back to Portugal. And so you have an effect here of what Salazar would see as corruption, because they're bringing ideas which for Salazar are Philistine ideas. So this is the American barbarians, the arrogant Americans who think they can organize life, political life, better than anyone else. These ideas are starting to come into Portugal and into the upper echelons of the Estado Novo. So the high ranks of the military are starting to be contaminated. Again, for Salazar, this would be contamination by American ideas. And then this also has a spillover effect on Portuguese society, because as the Portuguese military modernizes itself, as it pivots from being a classic land army to more sophisticated tasks of air power and naval power, it also requires different things from, for example, the military industry, more technological, advanced things. And so this has a spillover effect into other sectors of Portuguese society. And this channel of communication is what Salazar feared, but it takes time. to work. So Salazar is able to manage this up to a point. He is able to contain American influence to regionally or locally to the Azores, and then to the military institution, not completely, because again, there's a spillover effect. But in the military, you start to get what you can call the school of NATO or the NATO generation, which is these officers that go to the US and take their military education from NATO, who come back with ideas, with subversive ideas. And the moments that you have, the few moments that you have when the Estado Novo really shakes, when Salazar almost loses control of things, are from these men that come back from the US. For example, Humberto Delgado, we call him the General Sem Medo, so the general without fear, the fearless general. He comes back from the US, and in 58, he goes into the presidential elections as an adversary of Salazar, which was something, again, completely unthinkable before then. He loses because the elections are rigged, completely rigged. Later, he'll be killed by the military, by the political police of Salazar. And then in 61, so 3 years later, you have an attempted coup by another of these school of NATO, another of these NATO generation generals, who's Botelho Muniz, who stages a coup. And he was surrounded by these NATO-educated generals, but the coup fails. He was talking with the American embassy, and he was talking with the CIA guy in Lisbon, but he was too maybe cavalier or too gentlemanly, so it didn't keep the element of surprise from Salazar as he should have done. He was kind of open about it, at least with the president, Américo Tomás. So he laid out his game. He said, we're going to do this. So he asked Américo Tomás to manage the situation so the power would not fall on the streets. But the effect was that Salazar was able to head off the coup. So this is the situation that you have in 68. So after 61, there was a break in the military. So the military start to see how Salazar cannot think in the way that the military do, and he's getting deeper and deeper from 61 to 68 into African wars of independence. So the colonies, the Portuguese colonies in Africa, start to rebel, and the military have to deal with this. But they can see that the wars are not winnable. So these are guerrilla wars. These are very difficult for your central power, for the governor who's in the city, to be able to control the rebellious provinces. But Salazar manages to use the Azores to get U.S. support for the wars of independence at key times. But I'll leave that question for another time, for the Q&A if you want, because I think we've been talking for almost an hour now. So I'll just conclude by saying that the Estado Novo, you can think of this as gravity. So the Estado Novo, Salazar's regime, gets pulled into the gravity field of the US. So again, we can leave this to the Q&A, but he also uses the US, uses the Azores in the relationship with the US to obtain political backing for the empire at crucial moments. Not overt support, but he can get the US abstentions in the UN Security Council, and he can get in the UN General Assembly, and he can get US arms, so he can use NATO armaments, which he wasn't supposed to fight the wars of independence. But you have during World War II and after World War II with NATO, you have Salazar trying to resist the gravitational pull of the US, trying not to get drawn into the US influence, and it's the Azores the geopolitical and the strategic importance of the Azores to the US that prevent Salazar from doing this. So he maintains his objectives. He wants to preserve the empire and he wants to preserve the regime, but he's got to change the way he goes about this. He's got to shift his ways into a relationship with the US, which he tried to avoid, a relationship which got him trouble, but which he was also able to manage in order to achieve his objectives. So he's incapacitated in 68. So he manages the relationship until the end, but then his successor is not as good at doing this. And that's a question for maybe for the Q&A. How Caetano bungles up the US relationship with respect to the Azores, and in part as a consequence, he loses power and you have the Carnation Revolution. Okay. Thank you. I'm gonna
Thank you, Tomé. It was fascinating as always. Fascinating talk, fascinating presentation, fascinating information. We're just about almost out of time, but if there's any questions, I do have one or two that popped up through social media, so put those to you, and I think you've answered a couple of them already as you progress your talk. But one of the questions was based around the idea that Portugal's dictatorship would be very different if it wasn't for the Azores. The survival of the Portuguese dictatorship of Salazar might even be in question, was the question that was asked. Would the survival of the Salazar dictatorship might be in question if it wasn't for the strategic position of the Azores?
Yes. So I think it was a double-edged sword, the Azores. On the one hand, managing the interests on the Azores allowed Salazar to keep his neutrality because of what we discussed. But it's also true that the Azores posed the most serious challenge to his neutrality. So the Azores was something that interested one side, the Allied side, and so Salazar was able to, by maintaining the Azores safe from German influence and then allowing the British and then the Americans to use the Azores, he was able to maintain neutrality. But in that crucial moment, in those few months in 1940 and 1941, it's also true that the Azores almost precipitated an invasion from Germany, an occupation from Germany, or an occupation from the US, which would have ended Portuguese neutrality. So you can have your what ifs. You can say, what if Hitler had been smarter than to invade the USSR? Something would have happened about the Azores, either an occupation from one side or the other, but likely, or even Salazar being convinced of allowing the British to use the Azores sooner. But something would have had to happen to happen. Something had to give, but that's not what happened. So the Hitler got bungled up in the USSR, in Russia. But then you have another question, which is, after the war, did the Azores help Salazar's regime to survive? And we weren't able to go into this, but Salazar was able to use the Azores at crucial moments in the Cold War. So he always kept the American presence in the Azores. So again, it was very new, this thing of allowing the US to have a peacetime presence of the Azores, in the Azores. But Salazar always made 5-year deals. It was always contingent on a renegotiation after those few years were up. Maybe not always 5 years, but it was always a very short span of time that was in the agreement. And this was very smart because this allowed Salazar to wait for crises, international crises, that would increase the value of the Azores. So for a long time after the Second World War ended, there was a general expectation that you'd have another war, another major war breaking out, especially after you had the Cold War dynamic setting in, so after 46. So by doing this, Salazar was able to make it so that when the deal was almost up, he'd have a Cold War crisis. For example, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 62. The Azores were very important in maritime surveillance. So the US were able to detect from their from facilities and from patrols from Lazar's base, they were able to detect some of the Soviet submarines that were making their way from the north, so from the Baltic Sea to Cuba, because the Soviets were setting up a naval base in Cuba. And Kennedy went to Salazar. So Kennedy was very much hostile to the Portuguese Empire. As soon as he came in, he made it very clear that U.S. benevolence or neglect benevolent negligence of the Portuguese Empire would end. So the US would start to heap pressure on Portugal and vote against Portugal in the UN. But then you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Salazar was able to use that trump card against Kennedy. And you had this, what Luís Nuno Rodrigues, a Portuguese historian, calls the Azores or Angola dilemma. So Kennedy wanted to side with Angolan independence, but at the same time, he wanted to preserve the Azores. So he was able to play this very pragmatic realpolitik thing with the US and the Azores. But at the same time, his regime was always was an anachronism in an American world. So I think it's easy to forget this because we look at the way in which Salazar was able to use the Azores to maintain the empire, but the background remains, the context remains that this was necessary because the empire wasn't supposed to be there in a world that was dominated, or at least the Western world that was dominated by American values. Not that the other side was very kind on European empires. So the Soviets were also very obviously anti-imperialistic. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered, but
you did perfectly. And we're really just about out of time, but it's fascinating. I think we had enough to discuss now to have an ongoing conversation for another hour and a half or two. One quick question was also posed, but of course, a bit of a different topic, which is because of his fascist tendencies, not fascism states, as it was put here in question. Were there ever any that you know of or read any contacts between him and the other side and Hitler himself, or the Third Reich or the German forces at the time?
yes. So there was a leaning, like ideologically, Salazar would have been at home on the Axis side. I don't think there's much question about that. Much as Franco was leaning toward the Axis side. I think it's about the same thing until you take into account Portuguese geography and the geopolitics of Portugal and the traditional balancing act, which Portugal always had to do between the oceanic power, so the dominant power in the Atlantic, so Britain, the Allies, and then eventually, again, against Salazar's wishes, the US. And on the other side, against the territorial, the land-based threats. In the Second World War, it was a constant preoccupation for Salazar that if the Axis won, or if the Axis took a lot of ground, he would likely not be able to remain independent against Spain. So the logic of Axis expansion would have made Spain gobble up Portugal. So probably if the Axis won, you wouldn't have independent Portugal. But yeah, ideologically, they would have preferred a world in which the fascists and the Nazis were in power, I think. Yeah. Although he was also comfortable in a world where the British managed things because he also believed in the gentlemanly, civilizational tendencies of the British Empire, as he would see it.
Thank you so much, Tomé.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate it. It was a fascinating talk. One last kind of a personal and anecdotal situation, which is Tomé mentioned that the presence of the Americans in Lajes, and not just in Lajes and throughout Terceira. I mean, I grew up in the Praia de Vitoria, and we had, I mean, the Americans were everywhere. They're our neighbors and our friends, and gave us candy bars when I was a kid. And I just recall share this with you and those following us and our students as well, which is when we got to America in 1968, and we went to one of our aunt's house who had been here. She was born in the United States, so she came over before the Family Reunification Act and the so-called Cartas de Chamada that would bring people, that people could sponsor their brothers or their sisters or their mom and dad or their kids. And so if they were adults, and so my grandfather, both my grandparents on my mother's side, my maternal grandparents were both immigrants and married here in California and had 5 daughters, and then went back to the Azores. They lived here for 18 years, and so my these 5 aunts of mine, my mom was one of 8 sisters, 8 girls, and the first 5 were born in the United States, and 2 of them came in the 1950s with their husbands, and at the time, I think one of them with 1 child, the other one with 2, and this was, of course, even prior to the Capelinhos and all that, because they were American citizens, so they had the right to come back to their country and bring their husbands, in this case, and also their 2 children. It was a process that took a while, but they were able to do it. And so, the when we arrived about 11 years later, hadn't even been born when one of them came over. My aunt, I have one of my cousins who has passed, unfortunately, 6 years older than I am, and she turned to him. I was 10; he was like 16, almost 17. He didn't want anything to do with a 10-year-old, but she asked him, go and get some M&Ms, because I know Denise would love those. He likes chocolate. He's never seen an M&M in his life. I had to, I had to show my 10-year-old snob, Portuguese, Azorian, Terceira, and Praiense, that to tell her that I had seen those ever since I was born, basically because the Americans used to give them to us, and because I had someone who, my padrino, who worked at the airbase and was able to get some of that stuff. But it
You were
was
raised on
interesting.
M&Ms. You were raised on
Yeah, I
M&Ms.
was raised on, yeah, you can tell by my weight issues. But anyway, the idea that certain people in certain parts of the island, and we're talking about the 1960s, we're not talking obviously when you were born in the 1990s. At that time, the influence had been all over the island. But in the 1960s, when, for example, folks from Praia maybe would go to Angra 4 or 5 times a year, I mean, literally, I think that my grandfather, on my paternal grandfather, may have gone to Angra all of his life, maybe a dozen times, a year. I mean, a dozen times total, I would think. And so many people didn't go. They didn't have the need, for official things. It was interesting how other parts of the island did not know. I mean, they knew the Americans were there. They saw the Americans, but didn't have the luxury of having the M&Ms and some of the other stuff that my uncle and my cousin, basically leaving Portugal 11 years earlier when he was like 4 or 5, had not, seen one, and I had been raised with them, as you put it, because of the American influence. It's in the language. It's in, I think, and I think that it's been, written by different people, as you know, Tume, that the internationalization of Terceira basically happened thanks to the Brits and then the Americans, but basically the Americans especially, because it brought a lot of different things, some things good, some things not so good. But, I'm just to end, I'm reminiscing of a story with a poet that you know by name. I know that you do, which is Immanuel Felix, the father. The son is a great sketch artist, but the father, who was a good friend of mine. And Immanuel used to, when met Immanuel, I met Immanuel in 1990. So when I met Immanuel in 1990, he was a reader of some of the great African American literature. And I asked him, how did you know this? This is before, of course, he had been reading African American literature since the late 60s and 70s. And I said, how did you do this? And even in, late 70s. And he said, thank goodness to the librarian at the U.S. Air Force that would sneak books into, that I wanted to read. And he got to know her well, and she would allow him to, check out these books that were prohibited in all of Portugal, in any language, whether it be the original or translated to Portuguese, just to kind of give it a little bit of a human aspect, as you mentioned so well, which is, and the Azores have been used. I tell the career diplomats that come to the United States, they don't like it, but I say, a lot of times Washington only wants to speak to Lisbon because of two reasons. And they say, what is it? I said, the Azores and the Portuguese community and their influence here in certain states. They don't like that, of course, but it is a lot of the truth. I mean, and as you just historically pointed out to us. So I appreciate you. Again, I appreciate your presentation. I thank all the students. I thank those following us. Take care. Hope to have you back soon, and hope to have you someday here at Fresno State. We haven't
I
we
hope so.
haven't given up on that. Yes, we. By the way, just for your information, and I would like to. That would be actually a good way to connect. We just have a new historian on our College of Social Science, and his specialty is fascist movements in Europe. And
Wow,
so
big
that
topic.
yeah, yeah, yeah. One that never ends, unfortunately. But
Unfortunately, yeah.
unfortunately, so hopefully we can connect you with him as well, and we would love to have you here
Right.
in the future. But until we can have you in presence, we would like to have you back here at least next semester. In this means anyway. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Tume. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Okay,
Denise.
thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you.